Today we conclude our journey through the book of Yahushua by the start of chapter 23. All the land west of the Yarden River had been given to the 9.5 tribes under the leadership of Yahushua, with the might and power of Yahweh, who conquered the kings of the Amori and the Kenani. As we've seen, the land was allocated by drawing lots, with Yehudah receiving the first and the largest portion in the southern regions that were occupied by the Amori. The second lot fell to the two sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, who between them received a double portion, as promised to patriarch Yaakov. As we read in today's parashah, it was Yaakov who gave the blessing to those two sons of Joseph. However, the half-tribe of Manasseh split itself off and settled on the eastern side of the river, along with the tribe of Reuben and Gad. Having apportioned the two greater lots west of the river, the balance of the territory was divided up among the remaining 7 tribes, with the final lot being given to Dan. However, the last portion was a very small portion, wedged between the territory of Yehudah and the territory of Ephraim. The size of that portion became a problem for the tribe of Dan, because they were the second largest tribe behind that of Yehudah. As a result, the men of Dan conquered more territory north of the intended northern boundaries and settled many of their clans in that northern region. Now, the main Canaanite city in the northern portion was renamed Dan after their tribal father. It was much later where it became the center of the golden calf worship, at the same time when Shechem in the territory of Ephraim was also the center of calf worship. Now let's look at the earlier promise and how it was fulfilled. All the land of Canaan west of the river was the territory that Yahweh had actually promised to Abraham over 470 years earlier. Now it was finally in the hands of the descendants of those through the line of Yitzhak and Yaakov, just as Yahweh had intended. But having settled the 9.5 tribes west of the river, he now focuses his attention on the tribes of Reuben and Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, who had returned to their possession east of the river. They had supported their brothers in securing the territory west of the river before they were able to return to the eastern side. But they took their possession as they had agreed with Moshe while they were all camped on the plains of Moab. While it was never intended to be part of the promise to Abraham, they wanted that eastern side of the river because it was lush and well watered. It was good pasture for their numerous flocks and herds. It's very similar to what happened when Abraham came back from his sojourn in Egypt. Lot decided to take the eastern portion in the Arava, and Abraham ended up with the stony ground on the hill country. Yahweh gave approval for those 2.5 tribes to occupy that territory on the condition that they went with their brothers across the river and vanquished the Amori and the Canaanite kings west of the river. They were obligated to fight with their brothers until all the territory promised to Abraham was actually settled among the 9.5 tribes. The territory east of the Yarden, which Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh occupied, was captured from 2 Amori kings, Sihon and Og. That happened as Israel advanced onto the plains of Moab at the end of the 38 years of wandering in the wilderness. He also made it clear to Israel that they were not to possess the territory of Ammon or Moab, as they were both people who descended from Abraham through Abraham's nephew Lot. So the third portion east of the river was also not to be occupied by the people of Israel, because that had been given to Esau, Edom, the twin brother of Yaakov. So as we see, Yahweh refused Israel's occupation of those three territories, as he had assigned those for the relatives. Only the territory of Og and Sikon was to be given to those 2.5 tribes of Israel. So what about this summoning of Israel to Shechem? At some unspecified time after Israel had settled, we read that Yahushua summoned all Israel and their leaders, the heads, judges, and officials, and said to them, I am old, and age has taken its toll. You have seen everything that Yahweh your God has done to these nations because of you, Yahweh your God, who fought on your behalf. After they'd gathered together in Shechem, he made a covenant with them to protect them for the future. As Yahushua said, he was making the covenant for the people that day, laying down for them the laws and rulings right there in Shechem. Now all the lots that had been drawn for the various tribes had taken place in front of the Mishkan in Shiloh. So why was Yahushua summoning the people to Shechem to make that covenant? Surely it would have been logical to have it right there in front of the Mishkan. So if we look back in time to when Yaakov returned from his 20 years with his uncle Lavan, we see in Bereshit chapter 33, verses 18 through 20, that he bought a parcel of land from the Canaanite Hamor for 100 pieces of silver. Now it was that same piece of land that Yaakov pitched his tent, and he built an altar, which he named Elohe Yisrael, God, the God of Israel. It was a very fitting place that Yahushua would assemble the descendants of Yaakov, right there in that same place. By making the covenant with Israel in Shechem, Yahushua was actually confirming for all future generations and also the surrounding nations that the land where the covenant was made was actually owned by the family of Yaakov, the whole people of Israel. Now, in chapter 24, verse 27, Yahushua makes an interesting statement where he says, See, this stone will be a witness against us, because it has heard the words of Yahweh, which he said to us. Therefore, it will be a witness against you, in case you deny your God, Yahweh. In verse 26, it tells us, the stone about which Yahushua was speaking was the one that he placed under the oak tree, next to the sanctuary of Yahweh. Now these words are rather confusing, because it says the sanctuary of Yahweh, which is the Mishkan, but it was residing in Shiloh. Various Jewish sources have suggested that at the time this covenant took place, the sanctuary was actually residing in Shechem. But there is nothing in scriptures to suggest that the Mishkan was ever moved from Shiloh until it went to Jerusalem in the time of King David. So what's taking place here? An alternative and possibly more likely explanation is that not the actual sanctuary that stood right next to the oak, but rather the altar that Abraham had built when he entered the land of Canaan. As we were told in Bereshit chapter 12, verses 6 and 7, Avram passed through the land to the place called Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. The Canaanite were in the land. Yahweh appeared to Avram and said, To your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar there to Yahweh, who had appeared to him at that time. It seems very fitting that Yahushua would gather all Israel to the spot where their forefather Abraham built his first altar to Yahweh. Particularly when in verse 7 Yahweh appeared to Abraham saying, "To your descendants I will give this land." So what better place to record the covenant Joshua was making with Israel, which he's recording also the Torah of God. The oak was a very special tree for the people of Israel, and to place another memorial stone under the tree alongside the altar of their forefathers should have been a constant reminder to all of Israel that Yahweh was their God, and they should never turn their backs upon him. So having made the covenant and placed the memorial stone, Yahushua sent the people away to their respective inheritance. That brings us to the epilogue. All these events bring us to the closing verses of the book of Yahushua. As it was a fitting epilogue that we are told, Yahushua, the son of Nun, who had been a faithful servant of Yahweh, went to sleep with his forefathers and was buried in his own property in the hills of Ephraim, as he was a direct descendant of that tribe. It was also in Shechem that the bones of Yosef were finally laid to rest, in the same parcel of land that his father Yaakov had actually bought. It also is fitting that we read in this week's parashah, chapter 48, verses 21 and 22, which says, "Israel then said to Yosef, 'You see that I am dying, but God will be with you, and I will bring you back to this land, the land of your ancestors. Moreover, I am giving you,'" this is Yaakov speaking to Yosef, "'I am giving you Shechem, one portion more than your brothers.'" And then he goes on to say, "I captured it from the Amori with my sword and bow." Now the latter phrase in chapter 22, verse 22 appears to be completely prophetic, because the words spoken by Yaakov when he was blessing his son Yosef with the words, "I captured it from the Amori with my sword and bow," did not occur until 250 years plus after the death of Yaakov. It was his descendants who actually vanquished the Amori under the leadership of Yahushua. So we can see these words were spoken prophetically. In verse 33, we are also told that Eleazar, the son of Aaron, also went to sleep in death. He was the last of the survivors of that first generation that left Egypt. Of that whole first generation, only 3 people actually crossed the Jordan into the land of Canaan. The only 3 who were 20 years and older were Yahushua, Caleb, and Eleazar. The narrative in the epilogue also concludes as part of the narrative where Israel continued to serve Yahweh throughout the lifetime of those who lived after Yahushua. All the leaders that he had gathered around him, they continued to obey the mitzvot of Yahweh, and all the people did likewise. That it was done in accordance with what Yahweh had asked before they crossed the Jordan. So that brings us to the end of the book of Yahushua. I'd like to include a postscript. Yahushua the man. We are not given much detail about Yahushua, the man himself, either in the narrative of the book of Yahushua or in the books of Moshe. But the actions of the man were definitely under the guidance of Yahweh. So it's interesting to look at the profile, the identity, and the character of Yahushua as a man. He was born as a direct descendant of Ephraim, and his father's name was Nun. There is no further lineage mentioned. However, it is quite likely that he was a generational contemporary of Moshe himself. Now we know from the scriptural narrative that Moshe was born as the son of Aram, who was the son of Gehat, who in turn was the son of Levi, who was the older half-brother of Yosef. Hence, as Moshe was the third generation from Levi, it seems reasonable that Yahushua was the third generation from Yosef, down through the line of Ephraim. So based on these assumptions, it appears that Yahushua was probably about 30 years old when they departed from Egypt. Our first encounter with Yahushua is on the way to Mount Horeb, when Israel was set upon by the Amalekites, and Israel was leaving Rephaim on the way towards Mount Horeb. It was Yahushua who led the men of Israel into battle against Amalek. Now, Amalek was the grandson of Esau. See the connections? While Moshe sat with his arms raised, they won the battle. When he let his arms sink, they lost. But finally, his arms were propped up till the end of the day, and Yahushua won the battle. It was because of winning that battle, and because of the circumstances surrounding this man, his name given at birth was Hoshea, meaning salvation. But Moshe changed his name to Yahushua, meaning God is salvation. It's an interesting and important feature that the name Yahushua is an extended version of Yeshua. And both names mean the same thing. God is salvation. This is no accident, as all the way through his life, the character of Yahushua reflected that of Yeshua. Like Yeshua, there is no suggestion in Scripture that Yahushua ever married. He appeared to have devoted his entire life to the service of Israel in a unique way, just as Shaul, after his encounter with Yeshua, devoted the rest of his life to the service of Yahweh. Yahushua remained a loyal and obedient servant of Moshe all the rest of Moshe's life, and it was Yahushua who Moshe took with him on his ascent up Mount Horeb to receive those 10 words from Yahweh. Now, while Moshe had ascended up into the cloud and remained there in the presence of Yahweh, Yahushua was told to remain just below the cloud level, and he remained there for 40 days, awaiting the return of his master. It was also Yahushua who, when they returned from that 40-day experience, was the one who heard the people dancing around the golden calf. And he said to Moshe, it sounds like the noise of war. Now, following the golden calf incident, Moshe took the tent of meeting, which had been near the center of the camp of Israel, took it right outside the camp, away from the people, because Yahweh was disgusted with his people, and so was Moshe. It was the place where Moshe met with Yahweh and made judgments on behalf of the people. Now it must be remembered that the tent of meeting which Moshe erected was not the Mishkan, because that wasn't built till a year later. So Moshe had built this tent of meeting to meet with Yahweh, and after each encounter he would go back into the camp and relay the message that came from Yahweh to the people of Israel. Yahushua remained in the tent of meeting. He didn't return to the camp. Now Yahushua was a fighting man, and he remained as a guard around the tent of meeting, preventing any of the people of Israel trying to enter the tent into the presence of Yahweh. Such was the servant attitude of Yahushua. Now when Moshe sent the 12 spies into the territory of Canaan to reconnoitre the land and the people groups that were there. Yahushua was one of those chosen. He represented the tribe of Ephraim. Alongside him was Caleb, who represented the tribe of Yehudah, even though Caleb himself was not a descendant of Yehudah. Rather, he was one that was adopted into that tribe. He was part of the mixed multitude when they left Egypt. But only Yahushua and Caleb returned good reports. The other 10 came back woefully overwhelmed by the idea that Israel could not vanquish the Anakim, who were the giants living in the land. Of the 12 spies, only Caleb and Yahushua lived to enter that promised land 40 years later. We are also told that Yahushua was appointed to replace Moshe. He was appointed by Yahweh himself, and having received the mantle of leadership, he alone went forth and was worthy to be the one to lead Israel into the land of Canaan. So following the death of Moshe, Yahushua took up the role of leadership and fulfilled the task in the book of Yahushua. He truly was a man of God who sacrificed himself to the life and service of Yahweh and also to Moshe. And while he is not spoken about in great detail, in fact he's only mentioned twice in the Brit Hadashah, he doubtless will be one who in the future, in the Olam Haba, will have a role in the age to come. So lived a man who was so worthy to be given the name Yahushua, which means God is salvation. At every stage of his life, he reflected the work and character of Yeshua himself. Just as Yahushua led Israel into the land Yahweh had promised to Abraham, so also Yeshua will gather all the people of Israel from every corner of the planet and bring them back to that same land. Only then will the promise made by Yahweh to Abraham, Yitzhak and Yaakov be truly fulfilled. Shabbat Shalom.